Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Spencer and myself, Brad. Today, we're talking about social engineering. And, specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about how to mitigate social engineering attacks. But, I think first we have to talk a little bit about what they are. I would like to touch on some observations from our side, because we've, for whatever reason, seen a big increase in that. But before we get into that, some quick admin. If you guys like what we're doing, please like, subscribe, share with your friends. It really helps us out a lot in getting the word out. So with that said, like for somebody who's never heard of social engineering, tell me about it.
Yeah, social engineering is, the art of the con, right? And if you think of modern day con men, I think, pen testers, red teamers, and, attackers are the modern day con men. So social engineering is literally just tricking someone, convincing someone to provide information. It could seem harmless information, like about where the location is of, a server room. You walk into a building and try and social engineer somebody to figure out where to go to plug in a USB stick to compromise that organization. Or social engineering can be considered in the context of email phishing, right? So if I'm sending someone an email phish, or if you're receiving a phishing email from someone, from an attacker or something like that, that's a form of social engineering. So social engineering is really just convincing someone to provide information, to click a link, to perform some action, kind of just tricking someone in a sense. And that's kind of how I think about it, manipulating people to do things that you'd like them to do to achieve your goals.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, man. And it comes in a lot of different forms. And I think that if we try to start kind of categorizing things, you start to realize that a big part of what we do is social engineering. A big part of what the bad guys are doing, the most effective types of attacks. 25 years ago, we were launching Metasploit against Apache. These days, we're sending emails, tricking people into doing stuff for us. It's just a lot more effective. And I dare say like tens of percentage points more effective. It's pretty dangerous stuff.
Yeah, because, if an organization has all their ducks in a row, they've got all the controls in place, they've got endpoint protection and, good firewall configurations, and, they're locked down tight, right? And they have security guards at every door. If I can just walk up to a reception desk and get a badge and walk on through, or just tailgate somebody into a building, or if I can just send an employee an email and say, hey, log in here to access your new HR policy or records or something like that. If it's that easy, attackers are going to use the path of least resistance, right? They're not going to burn anything unnecessarily. And, they're going to try to do things that make it easy for them, because it's a business for a lot of them. It's a criminal enterprise, right? So they want to use their time effectively, just as much as we do as security practitioners, right? So path of least resistance is oftentimes social engineering.
Agreed. No question. And I would say, people are the weak point, I think, is a common approach or a common perception, and I think it's true, is that, we previously in the IT security realm, the users weren't on the front lines. And nowadays they are. And every user is a security practitioner, or needs to be, whether they are or not. And I think that, that might be lost on some folks.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. And I think it's hard too, because I think there is a certain expectation that users should be, should know enough to prevent some of these things or mitigate themselves. And, that's tough, because, we're asking users to do things that are not, necessarily in their comfort zone, or to spot things that are not necessarily in their comfort zone. And that's one of the things we'll get into. But, I think there's a good expectation that users should have some awareness, right?
I do. Yeah.
Of the threats that are out there, right? And I think, my perspective on it is awareness and training are two separate things. I think we hear a lot security awareness training. I think of it as two separate buckets. I don't know about you, Brad, but I think awareness of threats right? And what's out there, what could happen, what are the bad things, how to spot those things, and then training of, okay, how do I actually spot those things? What do those things actually look like? What
Yep.
do I do if I see one of those things? And those are kind of two buckets for me that I think though that kind of fits into that we as security practitioners can help, train users on.
100% agree, right? So words have meanings and meanings are important, right? And so the concept of awareness, straightforward, is just knowing that something exists, right? For example, if users are completely unaware that attackers might leverage text messages, SMS messages to, launch attacks against them, then they're not going to be as, they're not going to be paying as much attention to that, right? So we want to make them aware of the threats and the vectors and the different things that are going on. But that's only half the battle. I do think that training is the other half. You can combine them if you want to a degree from an execution perspective, but fundamentally they are different concepts. And I think you're actually doing yourself a disservice by trying to jam the two together.
Yeah.
I think you're going to be better off if you separate them and approach them, independently of each other.
Yeah, because oftentimes what we see is just organizations will just send out phishing emails, right? They'll buy KnowBe4 and they'll just send out phishing emails, and then that phishing email, like the user will click on the link, and then a training video will launch, and that's great. I think there's merit in some of that approach, but I think we do have to get to a point where we're teaching users like, this is why we're doing this. This is what this means. Here's what to look for, and kind of decouple it a little bit with the training, so that users just aren't used to being, trained in a way that they're going to expect that phishing email and that click to lead to a training landing page and that kind of thing. And everybody learns differently, and everybody takes in information differently. So a little video module for somebody might be good, whereas saying an email with a written description of some sort of thing to watch out for hits people differently. So I think when we get to a point where we're training people and teaching people, we have to take into consideration that everybody learns differently and takes information in differently, and make it applicable to a wide audience like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that for a lot of organizations, they want the easy button, right? A lot of folks are either out there checking that regulatory box saying that, yes, we do security training, or they don't want to invest in the time and effort and let's be frank, money that's associated with a thorough training program. And I do think, look, I'm a fan of KnowBe4, right? I think KnowBe4 is a component of a larger user education program that should exist within these organizations. And it's our responsibility as employers, as security practitioners, to give as much knowledge as we can. And, back in a former life when I worked in banking environments, they didn't give just lip service to phishing. There were webinars, there were people who would come speak to you in person at gatherings. Like, they invested in educating their user base, especially those that are high risk stuff, right? So like mortgage officers, executives, things like that. And you guys that are out there who are running businesses or part of businesses, consider doing a little bit more, to Spencer's point, just so people, because I mean, look, I'm guilty of it too. When I get that mandatory user training, I click on it, it goes over to the other monitor and it plays while I do work, or I click through it super quick, and because I think I know and I'm sure everybody does the same thing. So it does kind of lend itself to getting bypassed pretty easily.
Yep. Yeah. And the last thing I'll say about kind of the awareness of training aspect is, when we do ISO audits, we do, our 360 audit or our IT security assessment, or even when we do pen testing, social engineering, offensive services, the organizations and the firms that have the best security culture, well, let me say it the other way. The organizations that are best equipped to mitigate social engineering attacks are usually the ones that have a enhanced or a better understanding of these threats and kind of distribute the training across different mediums, and kind of, like you said, they do a variety of different trainings or awareness campaigns to help build up that security culture. And we have a number of clients that have a really good security culture that we work with, and the common thread is they take care in that program. They invest in different formats, and they speak to they speak to employees one-on-one, and they're there for them if they have questions about personal security topics or privacy issues. So that's kind of a common thread that we see that you can kind of take and implement in your firms if you're not already.
Agreed. 100% agree. So, part of this, a big part of this is giving the client the information, not the client, giving the employee the information that they need and the tools that they need to do the job, right? Like I think adding the little report phishing button into the Outlook client by KnowBe4 was one of the
Yep.
coolest things that was ever done. And I have to imagine that had a positive impact on, users
Yep.
and their security. But that's only part of it. We on the IT security side have to do our own stuff, right? So what are some things that we can
Yep.
do from a tech stack perspective that might help us on this
Yep.
road?
Yeah, you mentioned something really good, and it's something I didn't put in my notes to initially, but that reporting button, right? Having a technical way for users to report something suspicious, other than just calling the help desk or like forwarding an email or something. Having that click button, report a phish button, is really helpful. But beyond that, right? Technical controls. We want to make sure that we're not just relying on users by themselves, right? We don't want a single point of failure. So conditional access, multi-factor authentication, or some sort of secondary authentication,
Mm-hmm.
especially for things that are mission critical, sensitive in nature, that kind of thing. And thinking about it from kind of a least privilege standpoint, in the sense, or a zero trust standpoint, in that the riskier the system, or the more sensitive the data, or the more privileged the account, the more control you should have around it, right? And the more control you should have around authentication and where that occurs. So that would be my second kind of way to mitigate social engineering attacks: is good secondary authentication, good authentication controls, and conditional access, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things we're running into right now, and I mean on many engagements at the same time, like in the month of September, I can think of like 4 different engagements where they have MFA to a degree, but it's not across the entire enterprise, or it's not across their entire footprint. Or they have an MFA enabled across their entire footprint, but it's push notifications, right? And there's so we just prompt bomb until they agree to it. So you can pay these things lip service also. And it's really important that you are thorough and complete in your implementation of things like MFA. We run into companies routinely that just say, yeah, we got MFA. And then through the course of the penetration test, we're like, yeah, you did for like everybody. But then there's these 3 people who have exceptions. And by the way, the people who you would need to make MFA exceptions for are the people you need MFA on the most, because they're the ones with password 123 or their grandson's name and birth date. And so just keep that in mind when you're talking to
Yep.
people about exceptions.
And everybody listening can relate to this, right? To what I'm about to say. How many times has somebody in a leadership position or executive position, or some partner or something, come to you and said, I can't have this. It's too difficult. It's getting in the way of my work, right? Like I just can't do it. I can't have this on my account. You need to fix it. And they're in charge. They pay the bills. Maybe they write the checks, or they're your boss. And what are you gonna do? Say no? And then, I mean,
Yeah.
so it's tough, right? It's tough when those kinds of things happen. But regularly auditing those things, checking to make sure that MFA is enabled and that strong MFA is enabled, right, with number matching or some sort of thing. And again, conditional access can kind of really save you in a lot of those situations.
Agreed, 100%. And it's like we always talk about, it's a layered approach. MFA is not a silver bullet. It goes a long way, but it's part of security in depth. If I could steal a buzzword for a minute. All right. So what else? So we talked about MFA, conditional access. What else can we do?
Yeah, the other things I kind of think of in this context is least privileged, which I mentioned, right? Least privileged, zero trust, right? And think of it, when we look at kind of some of the recent attacks, right? When we look at, the MGM attack, the Okta breach, and you look at any breach, right, where there was social engineering. How can we threat model that and play that out in our own organizations, our firms, to say, okay, if somebody was to social engineer this person, what access does that person have? Like, what accounts does that person have access to, and what can they do with that account, right? So maybe for an example, maybe help desk shouldn't be able to reset domain admin credentials, right? Maybe they can reset standard users, but not privileged accounts. Maybe
Right.
you need somebody who's got a different level of access to be able to reset that. You kind of start to kind of put accounts into tiers. Um, the same way you would with systems, right? Microsoft is famous for having a tiering system. Tier 0, tier 1, tier 2. You can call it whatever you want, but essentially, you don't want to be able to cross tiers. So you don't necessarily want to have help desk be able to reset domain admin credentials, right? Or have a third party help desk company be able to reset a global administrator account or something like that. So thinking about how can we implement least privilege in the sense that restricting certain groups of users to certain things and only give them access to the systems and the accounts and the functionality that's required for their job,
Yeah.
and nothing more than that.
I'll tell you something else that comes to mind too, talking about this is accidental violation of the least privilege law. Right. And so we see this a lot, and we've gotten into some heated discussions with clients about it when they're, for example, using the domain user's built-in group to assign security permissions, which, by the way, don't do that, please. And so, but people do because it's easy, right? And then a year later, somebody decides to start making changes, or puts that subgroup or whatever. It's just the most important thing is to be wary of the fact of how you're managing these privileges, because we often see scenarios where users have privileges and most people don't even know that they do, right? Because Active Directory is a complex animal. But this goes way beyond that. I just thought that was something interesting to bring up, that we frequently see misuse and accidental issues of overprivilege assignment.
Right. Yeah, and even in Azure AD, which is now Entra ID, and Microsoft 365, granting users access to applications. Maybe you have a default group with everyone, and just give everyone access to the application. Well, maybe they don't all need it, right? And then maybe that adds to the attack surface a bit. So for sure.
Agreed.
Kind of playing into that, and I mentioned it already, is kind of threat modeling, right? Take these breaches, these attacks on these organizations that are public, and the information that's out there, and kind of play those attack scenarios out in your organization, right? Play that out on paper, or do tabletops, and kind of scenario those out to see, okay, if this happened, what would be the impact? Right. That's why we do pen tests. That's why we do red teams, and all sorts of security assessments, is to kind of help threat model that and tabletop that for organizations. So play those scenarios out, figure out what would happen if this thing occurred, and what would the impact be? What does that account have access to? Right, if it got compromised, and kind of do that preemptively and proactively to kind of mitigate social engineering attacks in the future.
Yeah, I agree. And a big part of this, you hit on it earlier, talking about the security culture. We have run into situations in the past where doing these types of threat model engagements or tabletopping, where there is this stigma of, if I fail or if I don't do well, that it reflects negatively on my security organization. And that is absolutely not the case, where it shouldn't be. Right. If you take a tabletop, report to an executive and they get mad at you because you didn't perform well, that's not really what we're doing here. What we're doing here is giving you opportunities for improvement. So, we need to come at it from that perspective, because this is not designed to be punitive. This is not designed to be, a negative outcome kind of thing. We're really just trying to find ways for you to be better. And you can see a notable difference in a security positive organization and an organization that treats security like it should be punitive, and it's kind of a bad place to be. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, and when we're doing pen tests and tabletops, incident response tabletops exercises and things like that, I enjoy the moments where we're like, okay, so what do we have for this thing, or what's in place for that, or what controls do you have in place to mitigate this type of thing? And there's nothing, or there's no response, or it's a weak response. I love that, right? Because it's like, one, we identified that, figured out there was a gap there, and called it to attention. Now you can actually do something about it, right? The worst case scenario is you go, you look at your security program, your environment, and you don't know what you don't know. And so by doing that, we call it out, we bring attention to it. We're like, okay, here's how you fix this thing before something bad happens. So that's great. And I agree. I think those things should be emphasized in kind of not looked on as like a scarlet letter or anything.
Agreed. Agreed. All right. So I like this last one that you have here. I think it's a good wrap up topic for us. So tell me a little bit about like kind of where you're coming from a defense in depth perspective.
Yeah, I think defense in depth kind of wraps this all up into a whole, right? And what we said earlier at the beginning was, awareness and training and not relying on users alone to be, that one stop, the one control to stop everything, right? Not relying on users because we don't want to create a single point of failure, right? We talk about defense in depth or layered controls or layered defense, whatever you want to call it. We don't want to rely on any one single thing, any one single control to mitigate social engineering attacks, right? The goal is to, if a user does get phished, that shouldn't take down the organization, right? That shouldn't compromise the security of all of our other systems or the environment as a whole. So that's kind of what I think about with defense in depth is thinking about security and your strategy and your architecture, like an onion or whatever analogy you want to use, and making sure that you build redundancy into those systems so that if something fails, the whole house doesn't come crumbling down.
Agreed. And I guess my question would be, I think everybody would agree with defense in depth from a concept perspective, right? I think you start getting into how can I have a more in-depth defense? And those are the questions we answer when we're doing threat modeling. Those are the questions that we answer when we're doing tabletops and pen tests and things like that. And so the amount of jaws that hit the floor when you switch off EDR, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're like, oh, wow, all of my eggs were in that basket. Now I'm blind and I have no idea what's going on. And we're like, okay, so that's a problem.
Yep.
Let's start there, and so, you'll get that a lot, I think. And I think you probably have some experience with it too, but you have to test this stuff. It's the only way to find the gaps. It's the only way to find opportunities to add that depth to your defense.
Yeah. And I think stepping through a typical attack, right. And saying, okay, what if that fails? Right. So social engineering, start from the very beginning. User gets phished. Okay, what if email filtering doesn't work? Okay, the email lands in their inbox.
Yeah.
What if, clicking that link, maybe you have some sort of, protection, right? Like Microsoft has their safe links or Proofpoint has stuff. And, what if that fails, right? Okay, the user goes to the website. What if that fails? Okay, the user enters their credentials. What if the threat actor gets the credentials? Okay, we have MFA. What if they do some sort of attack where, they steal a team session, right? Or get access.
Like an illicit grant attack or something,
yeah, or a man in the middle attack, or a session in the middle, browser in the middle, whatever the common fancy buzzword is. So stepping through that attack and saying, okay, what if this fails? What if this doesn't work? What else do we have in place? All the way through the endpoint, right? What if the EDR doesn't work or doesn't catch it or it's off? What if the user gets local admin rights? What do they have access to? What can happen? So kind of just stepping through that life cycle and saying, what if it didn't work? What if this, threat actor gets to this point, and kind of scenarioing that out, I think is really helpful for kind of figuring out what potentially you have in place and what your gaps are for defense in depth.
100% agree with all of that, man. And a big help in that is looking at the moderate attack framework too, by the way, just to, and all of this stuff, guys, you don't need to go out and do an expensive third-party tabletop / purple team / whatever, right? To do these things. You can do this internally, right? If you have the skill set internally, go out, grab the MGM scenario, go out, combine that with a moderate attack framework, put together a step-by-step guide. And, in a couple of hours, you can get a few people in a meeting and say, hey, guys, can we identify any gaps that we have based on what we know to be current attack, vectors? So,
and
this can be done.
Yeah. And if you want to actually run things like hands-on keyboard, Atomic Red Team is really great for that. It's a free source of TTPs that you can execute on your machines. That are completely safe. They're not going to harm anything, and you can actually test your readiness and your preparedness for those things, and whether they alert or not, whether they're blocked, all sorts of things, so that it's out there as well.
Sweet. Totally agree with that. Anything
I
else to
thought
close
when
us
you
out?
I thought when you brought up the miter things, you were going to bring up the 100% evaluation thing. I thought you were going to make a joke about that. I
We
was getting ready,
should. We
but
should.
that'll be
Okay.
another
So,
episode.
okay. All right. Fair enough. Yeah. Cause also if you just buy this one product, then, 100%
Yeah.
coverage on the entire miter framework.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we all know, I think everybody in the industry knows, there's no such thing as 100%. We can never be 100% secure. And even if you have all these things that we talked about in place and you're doing, you have 5 stars and all those things, there's still going to be that one thing that could, bring it all down.
There
right.
is.
So being prepared, having backups, doing all the IT stuff well is still important, right? Like we have to do the security stuff, but we still have to keep the lights on. We still have to keep, systems updated and patched and moving and, all of those IT administrative things we still have to happen too. And those are important as well.
And look, man, even the most mature organizations that we work with the most advanced cybersecurity program, that spend the most money, have the most tools, they do everything. How many of those pen tests come back with 0 findings?
Yeah.
None. Right. So there's always opportunities for improvement. There are always gaps. There are always, cracks in the armor. So yeah, nothing's 100%. That's for sure.
Yeah. It's resiliency. It's building in redundancy, layer defense, and resiliency to attacks is how I kind of think about it.
Agreed. 100%. Well, folks, that's all we have for you today. Thank you for listening and or watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends, like, subscribe, all that good stuff really helps us out. We'll see you next Wednesday.